This is an event that was first devised, as far as I'm aware, by Daniel Hahn, who's one of our translators today. And this is my act of revenge on him, because today he is in that chair rather than in this. In part he did it, and in part I think it's important because translators frequently talk about decisions that they make in terms of how they capture voice, or what they do with cadence, or how you create character. But if you talk about that entirely in the abstract, it's difficult to see what that actually means in terms of nuts and bolts. So in the handouts that you have, you'll discover that you have a text, which is a chapter from a novel, after which you will have a translation by Rosalind Harvey, one by Daniel, and beginning on page 7, which is the point from which we will work, you will find both translations side by side, line by line, so we can talk about them. But if I can first introduce those we have with us. Our author is Eliacer Cansino. He is an acclaimed writer for children and adults. He was first made the honor list for IBBY in 2000 and has won the Premio Nacional de Literatura Infantil y Juvenil and the Premio Añana de Literatura Infantil y Juvenil. Daniel Hahn is well, he's a translator, he's a vigilante and sort of a superhero who goes around the world righting wrongs in the literary world and that in translation. He has been chair of the Translators Association, of the BCLT, and probably of a variety of organizations I've never been invited to join. He won the Independent Foreign Fiction Prize with the author for his translation of The Book of Chameleons by José Eduardo Agualusa. And his most recent translation published is Maria Dueñas' The Time in Between. Rosalind Harvey translates from Spanish, and though a relative newcomer to the field, she's co-translated with Anne MacLean, both Dublinesque by Enrique Villamatas and Oblivion by Hector Abad. But her own first translation as a soloist, Down the Rabbit Hole, was shortlisted for both the Oxford Weidenfeld Translation Prize and also the Guardian First Book Award, making it, I suspect, the only time a book in translation has made it onto that list. As I said, what we're looking at is the nuts and bolts of why translators do what they do, whether they constantly think about it as they're doing it, how much of it is instinctive, and quite how different two texts can be, given that they're working from the same original text and that the translators involved are both not only highly professional but extraordinarily good at what they do. So what I'm going to do first is, Eliacer, if you would like to tell us a little bit about the book. Mm-hmm.
Yes. Good afternoon. I am very grateful to be here. I am sorry, my poor English. I hope my literature in Spanish will be better than my English language. Only I will say something. I am a writer for young people. Also, I write for children, but my most important activity is for teenagers. I think the young people, the adolescents, is the very interesting age, because the people in this age discover the mystery of the life. The life is very enigmatic, but when we are adult, forget it. The young people lives always in the border. They are always crossing boundaries. Your heads, your soul is full of questions about the human condition. These questions are important to me because I am a philosopher, all those writer. This novel is the story about a child who lived in a little town of Spain, and he discovered a different point of view of the world when he know an Englishman. In this chapter, which they translate, the problem is for the child how know what is the difference between lies and truth. Yes, what is different between lies and truth? This is the problem with the child have in my novel, because my personage is always discovering what is the truth. Yes, I speak very bad. Then they speak about the translation, and after, if it's possible, I speak something. Y si quieren, puedo hablar un poquito también en español. Bueno, gracias.
Okay. We will allow Eliacer to speak in his own language. We'll move on to the text. To let you know, the reason that these people are frantically making notes on the pieces of paper is that they were given this text separately. They have translated it separately, and this is the first time they have got to look at what the other person has done. And having been in their position, I know quite how frightening it is that you think, oh my God, why didn't I think of that? So what I'm going to do, Elias...
Quite good, sorry to say. Rather disappointing.
It's infuriating that other translators are good. What I'm going to do, Eliacer, if you could read just the first two paragraphs, down as far as abandonaba su búsqueda.
Yes. The first. What is, perdón, ¿qué es la verdad? Es el título del capítulo en el que un niño se está pregunta a un adulto si las cosas son como él las ve o son de manera distinta. ¿Qué es la verdad? Infundio. El señor Foster desconocía esa palabra. Nunca llegaré a saber bien el español, se lamentó. Fueron al diccionario, invitó al muchacho a que se sentara en el sillón mientras él buscaba la palabra. Perico, que es el nombre del protagonista, Perico lo hizo encantado. Secretamente, desde la primera vez que entró en la casa, deseaba sentarse en aquella butaca giratoria con los brazos y el espaldar forrados de piel.
Sí.
¿Sabes una cosa?, dijo Foster al ver cómo se repanchingaba en la silla. Ahí donde tú estás sentado estuvo en una ocasión el Great Livingstone. Al menos eso dijo quien me la vendió en Londres. Girando en ella, debió decidir si emprendía su expedición al nacimiento del Nilo o si abandonaba su búsqueda.
Okay, perfect. Rosalind, can you read the same passage, please, in your version?
Infundio. Mr. Foster didn't know the word. I'll never understand Spanish properly, he said regretfully. They went over to the dictionary. He invited the boy to sit in the armchair while he looked up the word, and Perico did so gladly. Ever since the first time he'd been into the Englishman's house, he'd been secretly longing to sit in that swivel chair with its padded leather arms and back. Do you know something? Said Foster, seeing how he lounged in the chair. Right there where you're sitting, the Great Livingstone once sat. At least, that's what the man who sold it to me in London said. He must have been spinning around in it when he decided whether to set off on his expedition to the source of the Nile or give up his search.
Daniel.
Infundio. Mr. Foster didn't recognize the word. I'll never be able to speak Spanish properly, he said mournfully. They consulted the dictionary. He invited the boy to take a seat while he looked for the word, and Perico was delighted to do so. Since he'd first come into the house, he had secretly wanted to sit in that spinning armchair with the leather-covered arms and backrest. You know something, said Foster, when he saw the way the boy was lounging in the chair. That place you're sitting, the Great Livingstone sat there once. At least, that's what they told me when I bought it in London. He was spinning around in it when he had to decide whether to undertake his expedition to the source of the Nile or abandon his search.
Okay. In terms of the intent, or what the gist of the story is, it's quite clear that they're telling exactly the same story. But of what we've read so far, only one sentence is the same. That would be the first sentence. It would be one word, and it's still in Spanish. All of the others...
We didn't bother to translate it in the same way.
No, that would have been fascinating. Well, we'll see later that actually there are decisions that you've made as to what you would do. I want to go to the title, in that it seems entirely uncontroversial. ¿Qué es la verdad? You have both translated it as what is the truth. However, in Spanish and not in English, la verdad can mean truth in the very general sense. Did either of you consider it?
I wondered about what is truth, but I thought that it was referring to a very particular kind of conversation. It's not exactly a conversation about the nature of truth. That, I think, is possibly a slightly bigger conversation. It's not about what is truth, but it's about the way in which people are conveying the truth and how you can tell whether or not people are telling the truth. So it's a slightly less, as it were, existential question. But of course, yes, what is truth and what is the truth? You would use exactly the same phrase in Spanish. But this is a particular conversation about two people, and one saying, how do I know when they, in this case, newspaper columnists, how do I know when they are telling the truth as opposed to telling a lie?
And what is truth is something that the boy might consider throughout the whole novel, but in this specific chapter, it is, as Daniel said, it is just about the truth within this newspaper.
If we'll go sentence by sentence for a little bit. The first sentence in your version, Rosalind, is, after infundium.
Mr. Foster didn't know the word.
And Daniel's?
Mr. Foster didn't recognize the word.
There's clearly a difference, but can either of you tell me what the difference is?
Didn't know suggests that he's heard it before, and he's just maybe ignored it because he hasn't needed to know what it means. Whereas didn't recognize suggests to me that it's the first time he's seen it, and he's looking at it written down, rather than hearing it being spoken.
Yeah, it's not just I don't understand it, it's just this doesn't ring any bells at all.
Yeah. But these are decisions that you make, and they're interpretive decisions which you have to make based on the original verb.
Yes, and I think, I can slightly kind of retrospectively justify what I was doing, though I'm not sure I knew I was doing it at the time. I do think this is a case because of the kind of word it is and because of the kind of context of this conversation. I do think this is a word this man would simply never have come across before, as indeed I think neither of us had come across this word before we started translating this passage. So it's not about a word being somewhat unfamiliar and him not being entirely sure what it means. I think this is a completely, it doesn't ring any bells at all. This is a completely unfamiliar word. He simply doesn't recognize it.
If we if you could both, Daniel, if you do the next sentence.
I'll never be able to speak Spanish properly, he said mournfully.
I'll never understand Spanish properly, he said regretfully.
Well, we will get to the difference between mournfully and regretfully in a second. But in both cases, you're translating a verb, which is lamentar. I'd like you both to talk to me about the fact that in English, about what we do in English with verbs like that.
Well, what we do not, on the whole, do in English is say, I'll never be able to speak Spanish properly. He lamented, or he bemoaned, or bewailed, or he sobbed. We tend in English, when we're writing relatively clearly, to use said whenever we can possibly use said. And if you want to color it, you color it by saying, he said with a smile on his face. He said, as he opened his parachute, he said, you kind of add whatever kind of bit of information you need to, but the said is the really basic word of speech. We don't even exclaim very much. Sometimes you will say exclaimed and shouted, but really, I suppose we could have said he lamented, but that would have seemed rather
It's rather melodramatic, isn't it, as well?
Yes. I shall never be able to speak Spanish properly, alas.
Yeah.
He lamented, beating his breast, as he,
Rosalind, do you think this is something that has changed over time? I mean, how much do you think as it were, the editorial process in the UK has changed the extent to which people exclaim, lament, and bewail?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I have a feeling that it happened a lot more before, but I think now if any writer puts he lamented, he wept, he sobbed, he screamed, then it'll just get crossed off. And you'll get told to have said, or sometimes shouted, but most of the time just a said is enough.
Whereas you'll find it's completely common to find in a piece of writing in Spanish or Portuguese a conversation where you have 8 different verbs of expression. It's very normal to use very different words, meaning said in this way, said in that way, said in the following way.
Yeah, so you
Lots
have
of
to
different kinds of replied and responded and expostulated, and it's a very, very common thing. Portuguese especially, you find 8 different lines of dialogue with 8 different ways of expressing that. And in English, it seems like you're just desperately flicking through a thesaurus trying to find new words.
Trying to find the right adverb to go with said.
Yeah.
Well, once you've got said and you have mournfully and regretfully, Daniel, I think he's sort of, in your version, he's given up on ever being able to do it. I think there's a fond hope that he might just about get there in Rosalind.
I have to say, I mean, I sort of like them both and sort of don't like either of them, to be honest. The thing which bothers me, which I hadn't noticed before, is, I mean, I think mournfully is a lovely word, and I know exactly what his expression is when I describe someone saying something mournfully. The thing which bothers me is properly mournfully, and then or properly regretfully. I think that's actually slightly uncomfortable in English. I only noticed when I was reading that aloud. I'll never be able to speak Spanish properly, he said mournfully. We'll never be able to understand it properly, he said regretfully. That's something which, because the structures of the language are different, you don't have that in Spanish. And also because in Spanish there isn't an adverb, there's just lamento. But there isn't that, I think, slightly clunky thing, which I think we've, to some extent, both done in the English. I'm not sure how we'd get around it.
You could say I'll never really be able to speak Spanish, I suppose.
Yeah.
I've also just thought of gloomily, which I quite like as well. Makes him sound a bit Eeyore-ish.
Yes. He said with a gloomy expression,
Yeah.
the hangdog expression.
To what extent, Rosalind, do you read aloud? I mean, whether you actually physically read aloud or whether you sound it out in your head, to what extent does the sound of what you're doing inform the sentence as it shapes?
I think it makes a big difference reading something aloud. I mean, I would always read it in my head, as it were. And if it's dialogue, then I would always read something aloud to make sure that it had the right rhythm. And as Danny says, often when you read something aloud, it'll be the first time that you realise that there's something like properly and mournfully, which maybe jars a little bit in English. So it's really helpful to do. And I actually have some software that I use when I'm doing a first draft, which is dictation software. So I'll often speak the first draft anyway. I speak and then it types the words for me. And that, I think it makes quite a big difference to how my first drafts come out.
Yes, indeed. Daniel?
I do the same. I tend to read aloud in my head, if you see what I mean. I do know what it all sounds like, which is why it's really disappointing that I didn't notice properly and mournfully before, because I translated this weeks ago and I should have noticed. I think part of the reason is also I do think a lot of people do that to some extent when they read. I think a lot of us hear what we're reading when we read.
Especially with children's literature.
Especially with children's literature, and I think if we don't actually notice these little bumps or these little these slight infelicities of the sound of something, it will only, show up in 6 months' time when someone is reading the book and they will feel this slightly strange bump. And there are things which I think may be absolutely accurate and may seem absolutely right, and it's only when you read them aloud you realize suddenly they sound completely preposterous. I'll just give you one quick example of a book I translated last year, a Spanish novel. It's about a seamstress, and there's a point in the book where she buys a certain number of measures, 7 measures, of a kind of silk fabric, which has a pattern on it. And I didn't realize until I read it aloud just before we sent it to the printer that I'd written that she had bought this, and she had bought that, and 7 spans of patterned satin. 7 spans of patterned satin is not an elegant or a beautiful sounding thing in English to my ear. But I had no idea. It looked fine on the page. All these words looked fine. There weren't lots of words beginning with the same letter or anything you would immediately notice. And it's only when I was in some way aloud, or at least aloud in my head, hearing seventh band of patent Saturn, that it occurred to me, first of all, readers are going to notice this if they sound things out. And it also occurred to me that one day some poor sod is going to have to make an audio book of this. And then you know, some unfortunate actor is going to have to make this sound vaguely like a proper piece of writing.
They'd have to rap it, I think.
They'd have to wrap it,
Just
yes.
one moment. For me, it's the same. I will never to be able to speak English properly. I will never understand English properly. It's a graphic.
Regretful.
Are
yes.
you mournful?
Look how regretful. I think he's more mournful than regretful.
Yeah.
What about you?
Yes,
The two sentences are the same for me
Yes.
in English.
If we move on, can we take, Daniel, can you take the next 3 sentences as they're broken here?
They consulted the dictionary. He invited the boy to take a seat while he looked for the word, and Perico was delighted to do so. I already prefer Rosalind's for that, by the way. I'm going to cheat. I'm going to steal some words from Rosalind.
Hey.
She's fine, don't tell her. He invited the boy to take a seat while he looked for the word, and Perico did so gladly. That is better, isn't it? Since he'd first come into the house, he had secretly wanted to sit in that spinning armchair with the leather-covered arms and backrest.
Rosalind, if you just give me the first line first.
They went over to the dictionary.
Okay, so while the verb ir in Spanish is a complicated one, you have them physically doing something.
I do, yes. And I think it's because I spent so long trying to imagine the table that comes up that I'd imagined the size of this room as being quite big, and I'd imagined him striding over to a table with a dictionary on it. And
Daniel, you're saying, by saying they consulted the dictionary, we assume the dictionary's already there and to hand.
Yeah, I'm assuming the dictionary is somewhere near, and also I originally had exactly what Rosalind had, which was they went over to the dictionary, emphasizing, which is what the Spanish says, they actually are here and they go somewhere. But I thought that was then slightly confusing because the next thing we know is the man is actually telling the boy to sit down somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And so this having a very clear image in my head of 2 people standing in this one place with a dictionary, while simultaneously one of them is going over to sit down over there. Even though mine is slightly further from the Spanish, I thought it was a clearer way of... Because actually what they're doing with the dictionary, the important thing is not, as it were, topographically what is happening in this room. The important thing is that they are resorting to the dictionary. They're using they are having recourse to a dictionary.
Yeah. I mean, again, as readers, if you read this in Spanish, one of the things that you will do is you must imagine the room. It's part of what comes out of reading the story. To what extent does how you imagine the room then influence what you do as you translate? You have a sense of where things are, presumably, in this room. Even if you don't understand which piece of furniture we are coming to in a moment.
Yes, all of the furniture was trouble in the story, actually.
Yeah,
we can talk about the chairs and the table, but I think you do want a sense of kind of the geography of a place. I mean, I think this is true about a room, but also about any place. I think you want to be able to, you want to know whether the verb stride is appropriate, but you can't stride in a really small space. You want to have a sense, I think, of scale, because that gives you some idea of how you are kind of colouring the things that you're writing, isn't that so?
Mm-hmm. And the chair and the desk that's coming up are both important. They're not just pieces of furniture, but the chair has a history behind it, and it makes the boy start to think in a certain way. And the desk is where the dictionary is and where all these objects are.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's move to the chair. Rosalind, if you give me
Ever since the first time he'd been into the Englishman's house, he'd been secretly longing to sit in that swivel chair with its padded leather arms and back.
Now, there are 2 separate things here. The first I want to talk about is you have both elected to invert how the sentence works in Spanish. In Spanish, if I can find it.
Secretamente, yeah.
Sorry?
Secretamente desde la primera vez que entró en la casa.
Oh, sorry, yes. It begins, as it were, with a hanging clause. Secretly, since the first time he came in, too, he had. To what extent is the decision to invert a sentence a conscious one that you make? And to what extent is it that you simply can't hear it in the other way? That actually you simply don't think it will function if you leave it as it is? Rosalind?
I think it starts off as an unconscious, sort of rhythmical decision. I mean, I may have started to translate this one in the order that it is in the Spanish, but for whatever reason, it just doesn't sit right in that order in English. Secretly, since the first time he'd been into the Englishman's house, he'd been longing to sit in that swivel chair with its padded leather arms and back. There's just something that doesn't quite work. And I feel like in English, starting a sentence with ever since the first time is very, very natural.
Yeah. There's also the fact that secretly actually does refer to what
To the longing.
To the longing. It doesn't refer to the chair or to going into the house or to...
Exactly.
So otherwise what you have, effectively, is a long parenthesis, which is not uncommon in Spanish.
Yeah.
And very uncommon in English.
So what the Spanish is really doing is saying secretly something, 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 which we're not going to look at too closely. He had always wanted to sit down in this chair.
Exactly.
And that other thing, which is sort of parenthetical in terms of the sense, but isn't marked as a parenthesis. There are no commas, there is no nothing.
No.
And in English, I think we naturally, we sort of do, unavoidably trying to tidy things up a little bit, because it's quite hard to be clear in English about how those things connect.
Yes, you could do it that way around, but you need to add commas, and then it wouldn't have quite the same punch as it does starting off with ever since the first time.
Okay,
I'm glad you did that too, though.
Rosalind, you've told us that it's the Englishman's house.
I have, yes.
Why did you feel it necessary?
Because there's a difference here in the way that we've done. So in the Spanish, it's la primera vez que entró en la casa. And I have the first time he'd been into the Englishman's house, and Danny has since he'd first come into the house.
Yeah.
So in Danny's version, he's talking about ever since, so it's this particular time he's come into the house. He's been looking at the chair, he's been wanting to sit in it. Whereas in my version, he's been in the house before. So I felt like I needed to emphasize the fact that it was the Englishman's house, because it's a house that's somehow become mythical to him, in a sense.
And it was the moment at which he discovered that house, which is not today.
Yeah.
It hadn't actually occurred to me that it might not mean what I thought it meant. That it could actually mean the first time he came, he's now been coming regularly, but this is the first time he came. It hadn't occurred to me that it could have that meaning.
That's because you haven't read the book.
That's true.
Okay.
I think reading the book is cheating. I think anyone can translate if they read the book. Just a wimp.
The chair itself is either a padded leather, is a swivel chair with its padded leather arms and back, or a spinning armchair.
What the hell is a spinning armchair? Who wrote spinning armchair? What the hell is one of those?
I don't know, but I spend a lot of time Googling antique armchairs and antique leather seating devices.
Plus Livingstone.
Plus Livingstone. An armchair and a swivel chair are two quite different things.
Yes.
I mean, swivel chair I did hesitate to use because it makes me think of horrible modern office furniture. But it does spin, and a spinning chair sounds like a bad translation. So I stuck with swivel. And for a while, I think I had with its arms and back covered, lined, upholstered in leather. I felt upholstered was far too technical, and you'd only use it if you were actually doing the upholstery yourself. And then I actually have to give credit to a friend of mine who came up with padded leather arms and back, because I was at a loss.
No, I mean, in upholstery terms, that actually sounds like what it would, how it would be listed in a Sotheby's catalogue.
Yeah, I think it works quite well.
Because there is a tradition that we translate at least some of this mechanically, I took these two sentences and put them into an online translator. So running from he invited the boy, and it runs, invite the boy to sit down on the couch while he searched the word. Happy Parrot did. Secretly, from the first time I entered the house, wanted to sit in that swivel chair with arms and furred back.
Well, secretly, I want to sit there now as well.
With the parrot.
It's been mentioned.
with little parrot, happy little parrot. Yes.
I have one more, which we'll do when we get to it in a second. But
The other thing which happened with the chair is because I, for some strange reason, fixated on using the word armchair the second time around. I then avoided having a noun the first time. I just said take a seat. I mean, I avoided using a specific word for the chair.
I like
Yes,
that.
indeed.
That's a nice solution.
Which is a nice solution, but it's a solution I wouldn't have needed if I hadn't insisted on using the word armchair, which is really confusing because I think you would never describe this thing as an armchair.
I think if it swivels, it stops being an armchair.
It just happens to be a big desk chair with arms or something.
But as we'll discover, the Spanish have furniture that no human being has. Okay, can we take just what Mr. Foster says first? Daniel.
You know something?
Rosalind.
Do you know something?
This has to be about how you create character, surely, is how people speak and how you imagine their voices. In that, actually, what is in French, and you know something is closer to it, but only because there is no other way of saying it in French, or in Spanish. It would be that regardless. But there is a more offhand, his relationship with the boy appears to be more casual if you say, you know something, than do you know something, yes?
Yes, well, more casual, but they also have, there's a slightly didactic relationship in that Mr. Foster is teaching Perico things in this chapter, and so the do you know something is like he's starting off a little lesson. He's about to teach him something about the chair.
Yes, indeed, indeed.
This is when I did try both. I think often we end up with whichever version comes first and it sounds right, but I did kind of back and forth with this a bit. And it was just about what he sounded. This sounds slightly creepy, but when he was talking in my head, this character would start sounding like a novelist. When he was speaking to me, you know, in this slightly weird way, this is just what he sounded like. And what his voice, it was a very offhand, sort of, you know, thrown over his shoulder while he's half looking at the dictionary and half, you know something. I might even have put, oh, you know something.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I'm not completely convinced by what I've done because I do think there is something, even though he's friendly with this boy, there is something slightly formal. He is older, he is more civilized and respectable. It's a slightly more formal voice. What's the Spanish? The Spanish is just Sabes una cosa.
Sabes una cosa.
Yes. If we take the rest of this, Daniel, can you just give us that small extra from you know something?
Just the paragraph?
Yeah.
You know something, said Foster when he saw the way the boy was lounging in the chair. That place you're sitting, the Great Livingstone sat there once. At least that's what they told me when I bought it in London. He was spinning around in it when he had to decide whether to undertake his expedition to the source of the Nile or abandon his search.
Rosalind.
Do you know something, said Foster, seeing how he lounged in the chair. Right there, where you're sitting, the Great Livingstone once sat. At least, that's what the man who sold it to me in London said. He must have been spinning around in it when he decided whether to set off on his expedition to the source of the Nile or give up his search.
One of you has bought the chair and the other one has had it sold to them. Is that important? In the Spanish, it is sold. But you've had a man sell it to them.
Yeah.
I mean, you've effectively focused on separate things. Because the Spanish is using people did X, and we never say one in English. By choosing people, you've had to say, I bought it from them, and Rosalind, you were saying, a man sold it to me.
Well, I think, to be honest, I think I just followed the Spanish, but if I were to justify it retrospectively, then it's maybe because the man is using this fact about Livingstone to sell it to him.
Yeah, of course.
It's, for people who don't have Spanish, the sort of direct word by word would be, at least that said, he or she, who is the word, sold it to me in London. And part of the problem we have in English is that he or she or who, we're not very good on imprecise pronouns and things like that, which is why I have it's a slightly vague, slightly cop-out solution. That's what they told me. And that they is something we do in English very frequently as a way of not really saying anything very precise because we don't know precisely what this meaning is. Rosalind, you committed slightly more to...
I did. I think
a
I imagined
single
the
individual
salesman.
male sailed...
Yeah, I imagined a salesman with his whole story about Livingstone. You must buy this chair. Livingstone sat in it.
No, and I mean, you either make that choice or you don't, but as you say, Daniel, otherwise, that you cannot keep that vague ambiguity except by saying they. It's the way in which we preserve it.
Or you do something which is even clunkier, but I suppose not inaccurate, which is do a lot in the passive voice, which we don't really like in English, but that's when I was sold the chair, that's what I was told.
Yes.
Which is horrible.
Well,
it's not wrong, but it's just
we have all
horrible.
been told since early childhood that we must never use the passive voice if we can possibly not.
Which is very difficult when you're translating from a language which has a lot of impersonal verbs.
I'm going to, Eliacer, could you read from Perico no sabía quién era Livingstone?
Yes, continúo. Perico no sabía quién era Livingstone, pero se puso la mano en la barbilla, como si él también tuviera que decidir si atravesaba la ría hasta Huelva o si permanecía en aquella punta de arena durante toda la vida. Se sentía distinto en aquella silla, como si girase en el eje del mundo. En la mesa de escritorio, circundada por un buró, el señor Foster tenía multitud de pequeños objetos. Se fijó en una brújula y en la pluma estilográfica. Él no sabía escribir con pluma. En su colegio solo usaban lápiz, que él siempre tenía con una punta roma, cuando no mellado. Foster desenroscó el capuchón de la estilográfica para anotar algo. Perico se le quedó mirando como a un cirujano que estuviese a punto de hacer una incisión con el bisturí. Al ver su atención, el señor Foster le animó a que escribiera él, pero aunque lo intentó, no supo cómo poner el plumín, si de lado o si vertical. Le pareció difícil escribir con pluma. Por fin el señor Foster detuvo su dedo índice en el diccionario y leyó: infundio, mentira, rumor o noticia falsa, especialmente si se difunde con mala intención. Ahora entiendo, dijo. El sargento piensa que el Daily Telegraph escribe mentiras sobre España.
Gracias. Okay, if we just take the first two sentences as I've written them down. Daniel.
Perico didn't know who Livingstone was, but he put his hand on his chin as though he, too, had to decide whether to cross the estuary to Huelva or remain there on the sands for the rest of his life.
Rosalind. Oh, sorry, I did ask you to do two, didn't I?
You did, actually.
Sorry.
I'm just being obedient.
Yes.
Things felt, if you're sure, things felt different sitting in that chair, as if he was spinning on the axis of the world.
Rosalind.
Perico didn't know who Livingstone was, but he put his hand to his chin as if he too had to decide whether to cross the river to Huelva or stay on that spit of land for the rest of his life. He felt different in the chair, as if he was spinning on the axis of the world.
As we'll see, there are, slightly later in the story, a couple of sentences together which are actually identical in both translations. But frequently what you will notice are very small changes which nonetheless create rather great differences. So there is a distinction, there is a difference physically between putting your hand on your chin and putting your hand to your chin.
I think putting his hand to his chin is lovely. And that's one of the things I will steal later when I redo this myself.
I think if you put anything on anything, it would be your chin on your hand, no? Because it's that way round.
And
also somehow putting your hand on your chin sounds like it's just a physical description of a movement. Whereas putting his hand to his chin is striking a pose.
it's a thoughtful expression.
I'm doing a thinking thing.
Did you consider stroked his chin?
Stroked his chin. Stroked his chin thoughtfully, mournfully.
Let's come to what it is that Livingstone was or wasn't crossing and what he was crossing it from. So it's either a river or an estuary, and he's doing it either from just sands, generic sands, or from a spit of land.
Well, it's not a river. I see that now. That's my mistake.
I
Quick
got something
reading.
right.
The difference between Rio and Ria.
Yeah.
Just,
But punta de arena either becomes sand, so we lose the punta, or it becomes the rather poetic spit of land. I mean, both of them are actually rather poetic. By saying sands rather than specifying, you're being rather poetic.
Especially in the plural, I think it's a slightly kind of over literary.
Yeah. And why spit of land?
Because that's what it is, isn't it?
It is. It's a sandbar. It's a sandbar.
At one point I had sandy spit of land, so even more poetic.
A sandy band of
but
land.
But then a spit is always sand. So
yes.
The sandy is unnecessary.
Indeed. And in the second sentence of this part, things felt different, he felt different.
Yes.
I mean, the intention is actually the same, although Rosalind's is more literally correct.
Yeah.
You're not suggesting that things generally for everyone felt different in this chair. The implication is that they felt different to him while he's sitting in this chair.
Yeah, mine is certainly further away, but what I think is happening in mine is I'm sufficiently trusting that by this point we're completely in the mind of this character. The center of gravity at the moment of the story is absolutely this character, Perico, and what he's thinking. And at this point you can simply say things felt different, and it's understood that we know who it felt different for.
Yeah.
I don't think you could start the story by saying things felt different sitting in that chair and assume that people would know who you're referring to. But I think given the lines that come before it, we're saying Perico thought this and Perico wondered that, things felt different when you're sitting in that chair.
If we go on to the next, we come to a curious piece of furniture. Eliacer and I were discussing this outside, and he thinks, and I would hope he would know since he wrote the story, that it's what we would call a secretary. Though he's using the wrong word for it in that case, as in a desk that opens and has a small number of drawers set around it.
I am very surprised. I am very surprised because the two translators asked me very much for this question about the furnitures. Yes, I think when I see the table, I see only the table with one desk in the sides, desk in the side, and I say it in Spain. Una mesa rodeada por un buró. Perhaps it's impreciso, not imprecise in Spain, but it's simple.
But literally what you say is then it is a table surrounded by a bureau. Yes. Those are the components in the Spanish.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
A table
Which sounds like a really crowded furniture shop in English.
Yes, but I think the furniture has a very problem for the translator, because my translator in Japanese is Kazumi Uno, who is here. She asks me, for example, when I say one baul in English is
trunk.
Chest, trunk, yeah.
She asked for me, what is the medida?
The dimensions.
How many is the baul? I don't know, because
it's not real.
Not really. I think only the baul, but in Japanese it's very important. The
size, the length.
No, it's Kazumi. Yes, it's very important. Yes, and yes.
It's difficult, his furniture, isn't it? You understand our problem, don't you?
I mean, this is not something that this happens quite regularly. There are things that we take for granted that are items that are, we have in a living room. But I mean, I've no idea what you would do with an English sentence that began, she sat in the Parker Knoll chair. Simply because for anybody who survived the 1970s, we all know what that is. It doesn't necessarily mean it will easily translate. One of the standard bugbears from Spanish is a mesa camilla, which is a table with a heater underneath the table, and it has a tablecloth so that you can keep warm in winter. But unless you have a full sentence describing that, you just actually say la mesa camilla.
I had a mesa camilla in 2 books in a row. I translated 2 Spanish novels last year, and both of them had a mesa camilla. And I kind of found my way around it the first time, thinking no one's ever going to notice. And then I started the second book and thought, really? Really? Another one? And the temptation is to maybe to draw a picture or to put a website saying, see Christie's catalogue from 1974, where you'll find a picture of this thing.
Well, to what extent?
Because it simply doesn't exist.
To what extent do either of you gloss in the text? If you come across a concept that simply is not going to be understandable to the end reader, or most of the end readers, are you ever tempted to just go, dash, which was a small table, you know, or whatever? It
depends what it is. It depends how important it is. I mean, I think it has to be a mesa camilla rather than some other table if in 3 pages' time this person's going to burn his feet. And it won't make any sense. You don't normally burn your feet under a regular dining table.
If it's necessary to the plot, and you can gloss it within the text in as unobtrusive a way as possible, then yes, you might do that. Depending on the length of the piece as well, if it was a short story, then increasing the number of words or having a footnote is not really preferable.
Are footnotes ever acceptable in fiction?
Never. Sorry. my considered view, I don't know.
Unless
never.
the author
I'm doing a book with footnotes at the moment.
Disgraceful. I'm not speaking to her anymore. I think where possible, I mean, sometimes you decide that it actually doesn't matter. This is a piece of data, it's a particular kind of food, and you either use the original name for the food, or you use some approximation in English. You don't need to give an enormous amount of explanation for what this food is, if it really doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Sometimes there are little bits of information which you can smuggle in very easily. So if the book is set in the example I gave the other day, if someone in a French novel refers to Mitterrand in passing, you might, if you're translating this book to a language of a country where people may not know who he was, you might simply very delicately call him President Mitterrand. It's not a massive transgression, but it does give you a little bit of data which all of the original readers were going to have. But I don't think you need to do that, and I don't think you need to do that any more than, or you don't need to give unnecessary information. You don't have to say President Mitterrand and then a footnote saying, Mitterrand, François, these are his years of office, and he was born in this year and died in this year, and he liked big jackets with size 11 feet. And, I think that if there is a piece of information which is somehow pertinent, I think you find a way of smuggling it in, but you always do it in the text.
Yeah. So on this desktop, which is set into a bureau or a writing table with drawers and compartments, there are either a host of little objects or a great number of small objects. And again, both phrases have a poetry. They're quite obviously, they create an atmosphere. There are 2 things I want to ask. One is, do you have words that are either that you're aware of as verbal tics, that things that you accidentally find yourself inserting into texts all the time, or the reverse, words that you absolutely avoid? I say this because, for example, I would almost never use the word little with objects, because for me, a little is a word that children use to say little. Now, of course, that's not true. That's just something that I kind of vaguely feel.
I think part of it is going to be just personal preference. There are certain things that sound better in my head than other things. But I think it is quite hard to it's quite difficult to make a hard and fast rule about certain words being acceptable or unacceptable, because there are some times when there just isn't a reasonable alternative. Infinite riches in a little room. Little is exactly the right word for that. And infinite riches in a small room would be a real dud of a line.
But that's a rhythmical question, isn't it? That's a rhythmical question.
It is a rhythmical question, completely. And I think a whole host of small objects would just have been really clunky if I'd used small.
Yeah.
But I think one thing which I'm sure you both find is that as translators, I'm sure we have our own little tics and words that we really, really just happen to like. They're part of our kind of, literary DNA. But I think also what we almost certainly notice more than anybody else is when our writers have these things. if you're living so intensively in the work of a writer, especially if you translate several books by the same writer, one after another, you'll really notice, which I'm sure their editors don't notice, and they certainly don't notice, these little quirks they have and these little habits of certain words they tend to use again and again. I remember doing a workshop with someone I was translated, and I pointed out to him kind of very casually how there was this one word in Portuguese that he used all the time, much, much more than you would expect, but it's not a very common word. And it was in all of the books of his I translated. Very frequently, he used it figuratively all the time. And when I pointed this out to him, he had never noticed. And he then, I feel rather guilty about this, because he then became very self-conscious about this word. And then, sometime later, he found himself writing this word and thought, no, I'm not allowed. My translator said I'm not allowed to use this word anymore. But I think you do notice these little kind of pulses or these little fingerprints or whatever image you want to use when you're translating someone else's text. I think it's probably harder to see it. See, I think I don't have any, and I'm sure I do.
No, I mean,
I just can't see them.
I suspect that we all do, and actually until someone else rereads us, you don't get them.
No,
I mean, there is a second...
But I think you probably notice the things that you don't like. You do read something and you go, oh, I would never use that word.
But there is a secondary thing, which is that both of you have to deal, if we get as far as the fountain pen, both of you have to deal with the fact that in English, where it is possible, we prefer not to repeat words, unless they are very, and or they is fine. But you've both elected, having said that this is a fountain pen, to reduce it to simply a pen, or indeed, if we need to a proper pen. Why is it that other languages get away with, I mean, on a page of French or a page of Spanish or a page of Portuguese, you could have the same word 3 times. They are, and it doesn't read wrongly in Spanish.
I'm really hoping Rosalind's going to answer this question.
Yeah, I'm hoping the same thing. Maybe we should ask Eliacer.
It is, I mean, I don't know why. It's certainly true. I mean, I certainly recognize what you're describing, that unless there's a good reason for repeating in English, if you use the same word 3 lines apart, the copy editor will circle it and say, you can do better.
It's seen as messy in English,
yeah.
For some reason not in Spanish or in French.
Well, that, of course, means that by virtue of the fact we don't do it often, if it is done at all, people assume it's deliberate.
It's for purpose, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, we will never get past page 2 unless we speed things up or skip things. So I'm going to skip some things. And let's move to the actual concept of lying. Can we move on to page 9 for those of you who are following us on parallel text? First thing I want to deal with is, it's not quite slang, but it is idiomatic. So the second sentence here, Daniel.
Second sentence of page 9.
The second on page 9, yeah.
Yes. Yes. That's the problem, lad. Which sounds weirdly northern for this man. That's the problem, lad. Newspapers try and pass them both off as the truth, and it isn't easy to tell the difference. Sometimes they organize the lies so well that they seem truer than the truths.
Rosalind.
That's the problem, my boy. The newspapers try to make both of them pass for the truth, and it's not easy to tell them apart. Sometimes they put the lies together so well they seem more true than the truths.
Eliacer, ¿puede buscar la frase que empieza, ese es el problema, muchacho?
Ese es el problema, muchacho. ¿Sigo?
Sí.
Ese es el problema, muchacho. Los periódicos intentan hacer pasar por verdad las dos, y no es fácil distinguirlas. A veces organizan también las mentiras que parecen más verdad que las verdades.
Okay, the first thing, as Daniel noted, that I want to talk about is the word lad, or my boy, in that how you're going to address someone, our sense of who this man is crucially defined by whether he says lad, or muchacho, or my boy.
Or son.
Or son, indeed.
Because I think my boy is probably, in terms of how I understand the character, my boy is probably right, the kind of thing he would say. On the other hand, I don't think my boy is quite the same as muchacho.
No.
I think it's closer, in fact, than the original to how I imagine this character speaking. But part of the problem is that any of these things, because they're very idiomatic and they feel really local, I mean, obviously it would be completely different if it was an American translator or an Australian translator. Part of the problem is that you're then really drawing attention to the fact that it's in English, whereas actually this conversation is happening in Spanish. And I think especially lad, which again I'm not completely convinced by either.
Yes, they're suddenly in Yorkshire.
They're suddenly in Yorkshire. And they're not suddenly in Yorkshire. They're still wherever they used to be. They haven't suddenly appeared in Leeds in the middle of this conversation. And I think it does, the more local the vocabulary or the language you're using, it does kind of draw you away from a conversation which you're supposed, in some sense, even if you're reading it in English, you're supposed to believe that this thing is happening in Spanish.
The next sentence has only one small difference. Rosalind.
Why do they want to tell lies? What do they get out of it?
Daniel.
And why do they want to tell lies? What do they get out of it?
So there's only and in the difference. And is and there just for scansion, just because it sounds right? Just because the rhythm?
Yes, because in my head, he's still talking, if you see what I mean.
Yep.
He hasn't just entered this conversation. He wants to know this. Oh, and what about that? And what about this? And it's simply to do with what this kid sounds like in my head.
I mean, presumably, this particular chapter
and there is an and in the Spanish, so I was also maybe being lazy.
Yes. This particular chapter actually has rather a lot of dialogue in it. Presumably, actually, when there are large stretches of dialogue, or when you've had a character speaking several times in a book, you do actually get a sense of what that person's voice is. And actually, therefore, that informs what your decision is going to be. So, for example, the decision to include or not include and here, or the decision not to have the pronoun earlier.
Yeah, you do start to hear the characters' voices in your head the more they speak. And certain things instantly seem wrong because you know that character wouldn't say that kind of thing or in that sort of way.
Yeah, you get a sense of the kind of words they use, the kind of rhythm of patterns of speech. You get a sense of if they are going to swear, how profane their language is going to be. And I think you get all of these senses in the same way that you do with somebody you know. I think if someone you know very well suddenly started speaking, even if it was their voice, was started speaking with a slightly unusual rhythm of speech or slightly unusual register of vocabulary, I think it would be strikingly weird. And this is true. Sorry, this is also true to some extent about the narrative voice as well, about the voice of the author or the voice of the narrator. You do get a sense of these things, and my experience is always that I'll do the first 10 or 20 pages of a book, and it's very, very slow and very, very bad, and then I get better and better and more automatic and easier and more kind of fluent as I become more comfortable with this voice in which I'm writing. And then you go back and tidy up the beginning.
Yep.
But you do kind of find your way into the flow, because every voice, just as every voice in the original, will have its own timbre and its own shapes and its own flavors. You're creating this in your translation as well.
Rosalind, you were saying earlier that you dictate your first version. Mm-hmm. Have you always done that?
No, it's a relatively new toy that I have.
And how do you find it?
It's really good for first drafts. You have a little headset, so you feel like you're working in a call centre. Mm-hmm. And so you can stride up and down a smallish room and just speak your first draft. It doesn't work so much for later drafts because there's so much sort of moving around of tiny bits of text that you need a mouse and your finger to do that. But for a first draft, it's good. You can get quite a lot down quickly.
Yeah.
And for dialogue, it's really, really good because you're hearing the dialogue as it is meant to sound.
Do you eventually then answer the phone and say, "Hello, question mark"?
Yes, it doesn't like swear words, actually. Not
yes,
relevant in this book.
Neither does the standard Microsoft Word dictionary. I've had to teach it so many swear words,
Yes.
and even now, it would really prefer that I didn't.
I do know a translator who has the opposite problem that she said. This is Sarah Ardizona, who is unfortunately able to be here today, but her dictation software ends lots of loud sentences with excrement mark because he doesn't know what an exclamation mark was. And for some reason it thinks that this is a reasonable thing to put at the end of a sentence as part of it.
Yes, I have a lot of sentences that end with "for fox's sake" at the translation I'm doing at the
For
moment.
fox's sake?
For fox's sake.
To what extent is your commaing instinctive? I mean, do you literally put commas where you would normally pause if you were reading this aloud?
I normally keep all the punctuation exactly the same in the first draft, apart from the upside down question marks and exclamation marks, and then go through and change anything that sounds horribly unnatural in subsequent drafts. But I quite like Danny's comma here. It's another comma that I covet. We did a similar event on Monday, and there was another comma there that I wished I'd put. But it adds a nice pause to your version here.
It's about, again, it is, I mean, as you say, it's about sound, isn't it? It's about making it absolutely clear what this sounds like when you're reading it in your head. I know the person who writes some of these things about Spain, and I can tell you.
Yeah. Can we move on to page 11? I'll very quickly do one more thing, which is how you've, again, this came at the beginning, because so much of this chapter is about Foster's use of language and the fact that the boy doesn't speak English. We'll do the little piece about the pescado rojo. Eliacer, can you read from Perico leyó con cierta torpeza?
Yes. Perico leyó con cierta torpeza. Red fish. ¿Qué significa? Pescado rojo. ¿Pescado rojo? ¿Alguien puede llamarse así en Inglaterra? No, nadie se llama así. Entonces lleva razón el sargento Efrén. Todo es mentira. Incluso las personas que firman en los periódicos son impostores. Esa palabra le gustaba especialmente usarla. No, Perico, volvió al diccionario como si se le resistiera la palabra y buscó, pasando las hojas con mucha atención. Son seudónimos. Los periodistas a veces usan nombres falsos, pero no para engañar, sino para no revelar su identidad. Tal vez ese hombre que firma Red Fish se llame Robert Foster, como yo.
Okay, está bien. We just take the little section about the introduction of Red Fish, Daniel, if you can read from where he began down to imposters.
Perico read a little awkwardly. Red fish. What does that mean? In Spanish, it would be pescado rojo. Pescado rojo? Someone can really be called that in England. No, nobody's called that. So Sergeant Efrem was right. It's all lies. Even the people who signed their names in the newspapers are imposters.
Rosalind.
Somewhat haltingly, Perico read out the English words. Red fish. What does it mean? Pescado rojo. Red fish? Can someone be called that in England? No, no one's called that. So Sergeant Efren's right. It's all lies. Even the people who sign their names in the newspapers are imposters.
Daniel, you've chosen to keep pescado rojo when Perico repeats it, and Rosalind, you've chosen to have him say red fish. Do you think there's any difference there? Does it matter?
I think it depends what we've both done before in the section where he reads out the definition of infundio.
Yeah.
Because in the Spanish, the idea is that it's a monolingual Spanish dictionary, and he's reading the definition out in the same language as infundio, so it's all in Spanish. Whereas if you do that in English, then the readers don't get to know what infundio means. So there's a slight change in I think both of our translations, where the dictionary has become a Spanish to English dictionary.
Yes.
And in my version of that section, I think that, well, hopefully the result is that the reader can tell that Mr. Foster is switching between English and Spanish, because he's done that before in the book, in the previous chapters, and Perico doesn't understand the English when he's speaking the English. So hopefully you can get a sense that Mr. Foster is switching between Spanish and English.
But we've both, in sort of opposite ways, had to draw attention to that. So you've added, Perico read out the English words, so you've made it clear that the first ones are in English. I have done the other alternative, which is, in Spanish, it would be pescado rojo.
Yes,
Because we're both doing this kind of sleight of hand, sort of like I was saying before, that we're somehow, on some level, you have to believe this is happening in Spanish.
Yeah.
And you have to flag up which are the Spanish words which are being talked about as words and which are just bits of the conversation. But we both had to identify explicitly what is in Spanish and what is in English, because half of the time we're pretending things are happening in one that are happening in the other. This doesn't have to happen in the original, obviously.
We are, I'm afraid, getting extraordinarily late. So if there are any questions from the floor, we have about 10 minutes.
I'm curious about the use of language. It seems like in your choice, you're a little more formal, you're a little more informal. I wonder if that's conscious in terms of patterning that you do, or if that's unconscious because you've done it so many times. When you look at the words you've used, they are a little more formal, they're a little less formal.
I think that's a fair characterization of the difference between the two. I don't know how much of it is... I think some of it is conscious, but part of that is because I think you translate slightly differently if you know you're going to have to sit in front of 200 people and justify all your commas. So I think I was more aware of what I was doing on quite a conscious level, thinking, am I going to use this, am I going to use this? Well, one of them I'm going to have to defend. I mean, defend, no one's attacking me, but you know what I mean. I think normally you do an enormous amount, not absolutely consciously. It doesn't mean you do it for no reason, but it means you read this one aloud, you read this one aloud, this one sounds better. Don't know why, don't care why, this is the one which sounds right. Sometimes you don't even have two versions. You do one version and go, that is obviously the word I want. And it's not happening on a very deliberate level. And I think this is also true with most kinds of writing. I think most of the time, obviously it varies from writer to writer, but most of the time you don't have a novelist saying, the man walked into the small room, or tiny room, or minute room, or minuscule room, or teeny tiny room, and then you try them all and see which one you like the most. I think often the word is there, and if it's not, you cross it out and you find the right word without really rationalizing in any terribly articulate way what it is you're doing. But as I say, it's slightly, I think that this is one of those nature of the experiment slightly corrupting the process things where I think certainly my decisions were, I don't think they were safer exactly, but I was aware the whole time that people were going to ask me questions. Are you conscious, as it were?
What now?
Yes. Rosalind, pay attention, are you conscious? Do you feel like you're, or either of you, in fact, do you feel like you make these decisions very deliberately?
Well, it depends on the stage. I think, well, the first draft you get stuff down. The second draft, I always look very closely at the original and check that nothing's been missed, no obvious mistakes have been made. And then more at the sort of third draft stage, I will read it not looking at the original and hopefully tweak things enough so that it sounds natural and that it works as a piece in English. And that's the stage when it becomes, when you want it to sound like it's all been unconscious. You're very conscious of what you're doing, but you want it to sound like it's being, you want it to sound like it's unconscious.
Yeah, I don't know 6 words in Spanish, so I'd like to go back to that second sentence, or second English sentence, which to me has a drastically different connotation, just how I've bumbled around in other languages, which Dan has said, I'll never be able to speak Spanish properly, and on the other, it's, I'll never understand Spanish properly, and we kind of focused on the said, but to me those two phrases, to speak Spanish properly is an active knowledge of the language, and to understand Spanish properly is a passive knowledge of the language, and the one probably is, to me, it's, you know, like...
Yeah, no,
I just want to know which one is it in Spanish?
Well, it is neither in Spanish. In Spanish, it literally says, I will never manage to know well Spanish. Okay. So how you know it, whether passively or actively, is a decision that you need to make when you're translating it, because we have to say, I will never either be able to speak it or I will never be able to understand it. But actually, in Spanish, it just says, I will
never have sufficient
I will never have
sufficient
knowledge of
yeah.
or, you know.
Okay.
So there is, it's neither active nor passive, but you're absolutely right. I had highlighted it, but they were forced, as it were, to deviate. They weren't forced to deviate, they could have made the same choice. But what it says in Spanish is not what we talk about when we talk about understanding a language. We either say, do you speak French or do you understand French? We don't really say, do you know French? You can, but we don't really.
The closest we'd have is, you might say, do you have any French?
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any French? Yes, but you couldn't say, I'll never really have any French.
I'll never have any Spanish properly.
I'll never have any proper Spanish. Yeah. I'll only have improper Spanish.
So, no, it's a very good thing to pick up on, because precisely, one of them has moved actively, the other one has moved into what passive would be. And the Spanish is somewhere in between. It is the sort of neutral concept of, I have a knowledge of...
I've got Spanish.
The only other way that I can think of that you could have gone around it would have been to say, I'll never really be fluent in Spanish.
Well, my Spanish will never really be very good.
My Spanish will never really be fluent, which has both. Yes.
Thank you. On the page 11, seeing at the red fish bit, I could imagine that it must have been so difficult to translate because it's a game between two languages, and that it's being translated into English from Spanish, but of course, supposedly the boy shouldn't understand English, right? So I see both of your translations and I understand them, and do you think it would have been too much if you just miss the red fish or pescado rojo questioning back? So for example, it would have been, I don't know, red fish, what does it mean? And then he answers pescado rojo, and then would it have been too much of a change if the boy just answers back something like, can someone be really called that in England?
Yes, certainly. One of the things that makes it difficult is just the repetition and deciding whether to repeat exactly the same thing or whether to translate. We've also both used italics in a slightly sneaky way in the hope of making it obvious that one of the words is supposed to be weird and the other one is not. But certainly, I mean, I agree that one of the ways of just removing one of the stages of it tangling itself up might have been simply to remove those two words.
Because, I mean, obviously, I understand, but I thought it might sound a bit, not odd, of course, but if the boy asks what the red fish mean, and the man answers in Spanish, and the boy understands back in English, like red fish, I don't know, as a text, I don't know, I understand why, but I thought it might have been a bit, I mean, you could have omitted it, I thought, but I don't know whether it looks too much if you omit the you know, pescado rojo, red fish bit completely. But yeah, I thought it might be one possibility.
Yeah, it's difficult because the second red fish you're supposed to understand as actually being spoken in Spanish, the reader, but it's clearly in English because the readers are English. So it's very confusing.
And that's why we italicize things, so you know it doesn't say red fish, it says red fish. So you know that it's a red fish spoken by someone who's not as part of an English conversation, which is different from red fish.
To understand, to know what a translator working into any other language would have done here. Because theoretically, they would have had to have pescado rojo left in Spanish, red fish left in English, and then at some point would also have to offer whatever, poisson rouge or whatever in French or in German or in Japanese.
But you wouldn't necessarily need to keep the Spanish, because there isn't anything which is drawing attention to the fact that it's Spanish. I think you can say red fish, qu'est-ce que ça veut dire? Ça veut dire poisson rouge.
Yes.
Poisson rouge.
Yeah, okay.
C'est un nom pour les Anglais, whatever.
Yeah. No, I mean, once language draws attention to itself in any translation, how you then navigate the fact that it's drawing attention to itself is rather difficult. And it's particularly difficult, and does happen quite regularly, where a little piece of English creeps in, and you have to try and still make it alien in the English translation of the text. We have literally time for one question, if there is one.
When you're working on a translation, are you ever tempted to listen to an audiobook? Because then you would be getting the reader's interpretation of a character. And would that help or hinder with finding the voice of the character?
An audiobook of the book that we're translating from?
Yes.
I haven't had the opportunity, to be honest. I don't normally do children's literature, so there haven't been audiobooks of any of the books that I've worked on, but it would be a nice way of doing it, I think.
What would be nice is to be able to listen to an audiobook read by the author.
Yes.
Because
that would
actually,
be lovely.
getting a sense of the author's rhythms of speech, that's actually quite a nice way of getting into a voice.
Yes, that's
But
why it's
on the
helpful to
same
meet
rhythm.
the author often
Yes.
before you translate or while you're translating, so that you can spend time with them and hear how they speak, because it's often reflected in the work that they write.
Okay, I'm afraid we can't take any more. Eliacer, ¿quieres decir algo?
No, I think the two translators is a good translator.
You would be happy with either?
Yes, I am very happy. Now,
You're easy to please.
Yes, now I see I speak English very well.
Yeah.
When I saw
Yeah.
this, when I see this translation, I feel I speak English very well.
Excellent.
Yes.
You know lots of very good words as well.
Only
Lounging is a great word.
only one typographic question. Why do you don't use the guion? Never.
Dash.
Dash.
Oh, it's just
yes. Why?
It's just convention
Yeah.
in
In
English.
English.
Dialogue is always with
Dialogue is like
with-
this in English
Yes.
rather than with a dash.
Yes.
Yeah, so in French, typically you'll have the...
Yeah. No, some modernist writers insist on using dash.
Oh yes, it's
Okay,
Instead with some disapproval.
I'd like to thank Eliacer very much for coming, but particularly to thank both of our translators for subjecting themselves to your scrutiny.
Thank you.